As your shared print project begins to sculpt an appropriate retention model, it will be helpful to consider the models adopted by other groups and to become familiar with a few fundamental decision points. This video assumes familiarity with the GreenGlass Model Builder, so if you've not already done so, please take a few minutes to watch our introductory tutorial about how it works. Before delving into specific parameters and thresholds, there are three preliminary and pivotal questions for member libraries. 1. What percentage of your book collection will your library be willing and able to retain on behalf of the group? We recognize that there are physical, logistical, political, and financial implications here, but in the end, an agreed percentage will become a target for your model. 2. What are your feelings about equitable versus inequitable retention levels? As you know, the Model Builder is designed to estimate the most equitable allocation possible for a given model. However, depending on the specific parameters and thresholds, some models will be more burdensome for the largest and most unique collections. There are several practical strategies that can mitigate inequitable results, but the philosophical issue remains. And 3. Is there an expectation that every title in the collective collection will be retained within the group, or does the group anticipate retaining a subset of titles currently held? To some extent, your experiments with the Model Builder will help to answer these questions, but we have found it to be helpful to gather initial thoughts from the group as early as possible in the process so that they don't derail subsequent conversations. Here are the title level attributes or building blocks that can be used in GreenGlass retention models. With these parameters, we can establish rules related to title scarcity, age, overall usage, recency of use, HathiTrust status, and a locally defined special category. A good place to start with the Model Builder is with a single rule to retain one copy of every title currently held. This simple rule impacts each project differently, depending on the number of libraries in the group and the extent to which their collections overlap. For example, the model to retain one copy of every title applied to the 14 SCELC libraries would require each member to retain approximately 53% of their collection. This same model, applied to the 39 academic libraries of Indiana, would require most participants to retain 41% of their collections, except for two small specialized libraries that would have to retain 59% and 75% respectively. The Retain 1 model, applied to the 36 East Cohort 1 libraries, would result in most members having to retain just 29%. You can see that there's one small specialized library that would be required to retain 38% of their collection. As you can see here, a shared print project with just 3 members, with a goal to retain one copy of every title in the analysis, can require member libraries to retain upwards of 80% of their collections. For many shared print participants, this level of commitment is overly burdensome. So it becomes necessary to whittle down the universe of titles to retain. Some groups have decided to limit the universe by pub year, such that the most recently published titles are not allocated for retention. Other groups have decided to focus retention commitments on titles that are scarcely held, either within the group itself or within a wider geographic region. Often, it makes sense to use multiple complementary parameters such that the final retention level or percentage retained approximates the appetite of the group. What follows is a description of 4 successfully implemented retention models that were developed using the GreenGlass Model Builder. SCELC Cohort 1 had 14 participant libraries with collections ranging in size from 29,000 monographic holdings to 1.6 million at USC. They necessarily focused on a subset of their titles to retain. Their model had 2 rules. The first is to retain all scarcely held titles published before 1990. They defined scarcely held as any titles that are unique among the participant libraries and held by fewer than 5 libraries in all of California. The second rule was designed to create opportunities for member libraries to weed surplus copies. This rule says to retain one holding of all titles not unique within the group if published before 2005. As you can imagine, experimenting with the level of California holdings and with the pub year threshold made it possible for the group to arrive at the acceptable level of 25% retention. This model results in a perfectly equitable retention commitment of 25% for all participant libraries, which was an important goal for the group. Keep in mind that the biggest libraries are represented by points on the far right of the scatter plot. The vertical axis represents the percentage of holdings that would be retained. East Cohort 1 had 36 participant libraries ranging in size from 47,000 holdings all the way up to 1.4 million. The final East model contained 3 rules, and as you can see, there were 2 categories of material that were excluded from all 3. Guidebooks, textbooks, and test prep materials flagged as ephemera, and anything published after 2011. Like SCELC, this group agreed to retain all scarcely held titles. But the East definition of scarcely held cast a considerably wider net. For East, titles held by fewer than 5 participant libraries, and fewer than 40 U.S. libraries, and fewer than 5 large academic libraries in the region, and not retained by Connect New York retention partners, were defined as scarce. The second East rule says to retain up to 5 copies of titles that have accumulated significant use. They defined significant use as more than 30 aggregate uses among member libraries. The third rule in this model says that if the title was not identified as scarcely held in Rule 1 and not identified as heavily used in Rule 2, then the group would commit to retaining a single copy or holding. The model builder lets us see that this model would require that all participant libraries commit to retain about 36% of their print book collections. Above all else, the 10 Copal libraries sought to protect resources they defined as Canadiana. Their retention model was comprised of 3 rules. The first rule says to retain 3 copies of titles flagged as Canadiana if they're not held at the University of Alberta or at the University of British Columbia. The second rule is to retain just 2 copies of titles flagged as Canadiana if they are held by U Alberta or UBC. The third rule says that the group will retain 1 copy of non-Canadiana if it's not held by U Alberta or UBC and held by fewer than 3 Copal non-participants, and the same edition is held by fewer than 2 Carl libraries, and any edition was held by fewer than 5 Carl libraries. As you can see, this model required participant libraries to retain between 13 and 21% of their print monographs. The last of our 4 models is the one constructed by the second MI-SPI cohort, which was comprised of 9 libraries in Michigan. They ranged in size from 106,000 to 561,000 monographic holdings. Before reviewing this model, you should know that Eastern and Western Michigan universities both participated in the MI-SPI Cohort 1 and made significant retention commitments at that time. The University of Michigan and Michigan State were standard comparators. This MI-SPI model has 3 rules. The first rule is to retain all holdings for titles that are scarcely held. The MI-SPI definition of scarcely held is any title held by fewer than 3 group participants, not retained by EMU or WMU, held by fewer than 50 U.S. libraries, and not held by the University of Michigan or by Michigan State. Their second rule says to retain 2 copies of all titles that are held by more than 2 group participants that are not retained by EMU or WMU and that were published before 2005. Their third rule says to retain just 1 copy of titles held by more than 2 group participants that are being retained by either EMU or WMU and that were published before 2005. This model required that each of the 9 MI-SPI libraries retain about 18% of their print books. So to summarize, it'll be important to think ahead of time about a reasonable and responsible level of retention for each participant library and for the group as a whole. This percentage will become the target for your modeling exercises. You can tweak the thresholds of your retention model to approximate the retention percentage that is comfortable for the group. Most groups choose to make retention commitments for a subset of the titles under analysis because it's overly burdensome to retain all. Very often they commit to retaining scarcely held titles, defining scarcely held in their own way according to their own sensibilities. If one of the goals of your shared print project is to create safe weeding opportunities for members, it will be important to retain within the group some number of titles that are widely held. In this way, it will be possible for participants to identify surplus copies in their own collections, knowing that retained holdings in partner libraries will be accessible to their users for the duration of the commitment. And finally, we want to point out that many successful shared print projects include collections that range in size from very small to very large. Even the smallest libraries can contribute their fair share to the protection of the collective collection.